Hello everybody, thanks so much for joining my Lightroom workshop part 2. This is where I'm going to talk about some of the more advanced tips and tricks and techniques that you can use within Lightroom to edit your photos. The local area adjustments is what we're going to be spending a lot of time on in this workshop, and it's a fantastic series of tools that really allow you to dial in and easily edit a specific portion of your image. They're awesome, they're powerful, they might seem complicated, but after today, I think you really will find that they're quite easy to work with and the power they give you is just awesome. So keep that in mind. The handout that's available to you is at photorec.tv/Lightroom2. It is a 12-page full-color PDF. Full color meaning lots of pretty pictures, much more pretty than the handout I have in my hands where I printed it out on my black and white printer. Packed full of all of the tips and tricks we'll cover today in nice written form, and including on the front page this keyboard shortcut guide. I did it on the very front page so that you could print just page 1 if you want and stick it up next to your monitor. If there is one thing that will greatly speed up your editing in any program, it's to learn the keyboard shortcuts. You don't have to learn all of them. You don't have to memorize all of this, but take some time and pick up some of those ones that you use more frequently. It's going to be so much faster to tap a key on the keyboard than it is to navigate your mouse through the menu structure or over to the little different icons. So this content is all there for you. As I said, but we had a few tech issues at the beginning, so you might have missed it. If you missed earlier workshops, I've now done a over 2-hour workshop that is completely free and still available for you to watch on my YouTube channel. That's at photorec.tv/Lightroom. That one is a 19-page handout along with an over 2-hour video, all there for you to watch. So take a look at that. If you are watching live, I've got a challenge, an edit challenge. I've given you some sample photos for you to follow along as well. I'll show you how to import those in just a few moments if you need that help. And you can edit the Zion National Park picture and submit to me before the end of the show. I'll be showcasing as many of those edits as I can towards the end of the show and just kind of compare and contrast how you might edit it or how I have edited it and how you arrived at that. So go to photorec.tv/Lightroom2 to access all of that content and follow along with editing and submit your image for the Lightroom Editing Challenge. I just thought I'd throw that in there as a little bit of extra fun. A couple of weeks ago, it wasn't so related to Lightroom, but I did a workshop on web design and building a website for photographers. You might be interested in that. That's linked down below as well. And along with that, I reviewed some websites and then came back with another video. So it was really fun to kind of incorporate your work with what I was talking about. I enjoyed that. And again, if you're watching live, please, if you've got a question, stick it in the chat. It's nice to put a little Q in front of it. Roy, thank you so much for being in the chat. He is watching for those questions and he's gathering together, and we'll have some break points where I stop and answer a few of those. All right. I think that's the main stuff that I wanted to get out of the way real quick on social media. If you don't already follow me, I'd love a follow. PhotorecToby on Instagram and also on Twitter. And on YouTube, where you're watching this video, you can hit that thumbs up and the subscribe button if you're not already a subscriber. So thanks so much for all of that. What I want to do real quick is just take you on a quick tour of the Photo Enthusiast Network. Photo Enthusiast Network, I founded along with David and Allie and Steve. We are a group of professional photographers passionate about education and photography, both. So I want to talk a little bit about what we offer, and really just a little bit. These are the categories of the different videos and written tutorials. Tons and tons of content. You're watching a video about Lightroom. You're probably interested in editing, so we're going to dive into that real quick. And through this, you see all of our Photoshop videos. There's more. Quick Lightroom tutorials. You're about to watch a Lightroom workshop, this one that I'm talking to you right now. Gosh, I don't know. I think this is going to run for about 90 minutes, I think, depending on number of questions and how detailed I get on some things. But you might want to be able to pick up a 5-minute introduction to the color and HSL panel. Or you might want to look in deeper dive into sharpening in Lightroom. Then we've got the complete guide It's kind of broken up into chapters similar to what we're talking about today. We don't just talk about Lightroom and Photoshop. We've got Nick, then we've got editing people, full edits. Watch us edit from start to finish, astrophotography, additional updated Lightroom training videos, and then we talk about Snapseed and DxO and Capture One. And then David's very, very impressive and very popular creating fine art black and white series. So this was just the editing section. There is tons of content in your membership area. We are running a sale right now. When you go to get the free handout, you'll be provided all of the information on the sale. And it is just a fantastic community and resource for photographers. And I'm really, really proud of what we provide there. So check it out. And if you'd like to learn more information, you'll get a link in your email after you get a handout that has all of that content in it. Thanks. Thanks for following along on that. Okay. So I said a lot of the local area adjustments today, but we're also going to talk about the Transform tool. It's not just for fixing buildings that might be leaning this way or that because of a wider angle lens that you use to shoot it. It can also be used in nature in a lot of different ways. We're also going to be talking about making a trip to Photoshop and back from Lightroom, and we're going to talk a little bit about exporting. Not a ton, because my other workshop that I ran earlier, we did cover that, and that handout covers it in great detail. But I've made some changes and updates. And for anybody who already has the couple of weeks ago handout, there is some overlap with the local area adjustment tools. We touched on it in that workshop, but not enough. Not enough time to spend on something that is so fantastic. So that's what I really wanted to do in this workshop. So it talks about local area adjustments in that older handout, but you really do want to get this updated one because I've been working on it for the last couple of days, really updating it with everything and taking the time to kind of expand on some of the tips, techniques, and tricks that are going to get you to be more successful using these tools. All right, now that all said, let's dive in. And just one more time, the handout and all of that information is available at photorec.tv/Lightroom2. That's the numeral 2. Okay, so we're going to jump over to Lightroom. And the first thing that you're going to want to do, and the first thing I'm going to cover right now, is to tell you how to get the sample photos into Lightroom. And again, those are available at photorec.tv/Lightroom2. It's the same address. All right, so I've got these photos in here already. I made them slightly smaller DNGs just not to clog up the internet with everybody downloading because they're fairly large files. There's a couple of different ways that you can get these files in here. I'm going to go ahead and just remove this folder for a moment because I want to show you. All right, I've already downloaded the folders and unzipped the little package that I provide for you. It's sitting on my desktop. So here I am in the import dialog box and I can hit import. That's going to ask me, where do I want to import from? Typically, we're importing from an SD card or some kind of removable media. But in this case, they're on my desktop. So I'm going to navigate to users. This is on a Mac. And then on my desktop, I have Workshop Share. I have a little A after the folder. I click on that and instantly the 6 files that I'm providing as sample appear. Up here at the top, when we're typically importing from an SD card or compact flash card or something of that sort, we're copying the files. You have still the choice to copy. We could, at this point, move them from our desktop and or copy them from the desktop and put them into the spot where we keep all of our pictures. I don't think I would recommend you do that necessarily in this case because these are really different than your day-to-day pictures. These are samples provided for this workshop. You could move them to consolidate and copy and move. I want to come back with another workshop, and that's another thing I would love chat room for you to do as we go along, suggest future topics for workshops because I'm a very suggestible person. So one of the things I'd love to come back to is a deeper dive into organizing in the Lightroom, how to kind of consolidate older hard drives, bring all files together into one place, move them all around, and keep Lightroom happy. That's the key. You can move files all around, but it's really easy to make Lightroom unhappy. We've probably all run into that where you get the little exclamation point, hey, Lightroom doesn't know where this file is. That is something that I actually help with on one-on-one training, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So I'm going to simply add them to my catalog, and that means that Lightroom is going to become aware of these files. It's going to leave them where it is, but now it's going to add them. And over here, build previews 1-to-1, sure. I don't need to build smart previews. I cover all of this in real detail in that last week's workshop. Develop settings. I really love my auto perfection or my new Automagic import presets that apply the auto edit on import. But I'm not going to do that now because I want to kind of start from scratch for these really as a teaching purpose. And no keywords or anything like that. And notice we don't have a destination here because we are simply adding them to the catalog. We're not copying or moving them anywhere else. So I'm just going to hit import. And voila, they show up on the Macintosh hard drive here. And sometimes if you want, you can, not sometimes, you can always do this, but only sometimes might you want to, right click on that folder and say show parent folder. If you're confused about where something is, you can say show parent folder. Oh, look, it's on the desktop inside this. And so then you have the ability to kind of minimize or maximize and see those pictures within those subfolders. So, all right. Now, first page of the guide is all about the keyboard shortcuts, which I said you can print out. Let's start with this image right here. This is snowy Yosemite National Park from just a few months ago. And I often shoot my pictures a little underexposed to protect the highlights. So in this case, there were some beautiful little slivers of color up on the clouds in the sky, and I really wanted to make sure that I captured that. If I felt like I had exposed it so that the landscape was brighter, this would have been very bright and possibly lost some of that color. So that's why we have this. But then we're left with this look of, well, the landscape is really kind of blah. So let's move over to the Develop panel. We're jumping right in, and before we do any local area adjustments, we've got to kind of do our basic area adjustments. So the very first thing I want to do is just kind of bring up the exposure a bit. You see, as soon as I start to do that, I'm washing out the sky and starting to lose some of that color. So I'm really going to kind of leave that alone, maybe bring it back down a little bit, just like that. Now I'm going to bring up the shadows to see if I can get some of that more detail out of that down there. Yes. I'll repeat some of my original workshop just because it's important. If you find yourself moving sliders all the way up to 100, then you are probably not doing yourself any good service because there is a point of diminishing returns as you move those sliders up, and you run the risk of flattening your image, so to speak. So I'm going to bring it up to about 60 or 70, and what you can do is go into a local area adjustment instead, but we'll come back to that. The whites, I think we can bring those up a little bit more. There's a lot of snow down there in the foreground, but again, you can start to see as I move it, really start to lose that sky. So I'm going to be pretty gentle with that. And the blacks, you know, you're bringing it up, it brightens the foreground, but what really starts to happen is it just kind of gets washed out and it doesn't have that nice contrast as much. So I'm really going to keep that similar to what it was. Okay, I think this is a pretty good start. This was an image that was captured at dawn. So in my memory, the foreground was a little dim and the sky was just starting to show that morning light. We can get into a very philosophical discussion. Go over here a little bit more, where how much editing should you do on an image? And really, I'm not going to make any opinions about that and tell you what you should do. You need to decide. Generally, my feeling is it needs to look natural for me to what it could look like on its very best day. So maybe I'll take it a little bit further than what my eyes saw that day, but I'll never take it further than I don't think it could be on a really good day at that location. Does that make sense? That's me personally. So we're going to come down. My texture, I always raise a little bit, clarity a little bit, dehaze. I don't think this image needs any. Sure, there's some haze way back here and a little bit of half dome peeking out. But you know what? That gives me a sense of the depth of this image. And if I just remove the haze with the dehaze tool, then I feel like the image starts to look a little flatter. It also lowers the blacks. That's part of the way it dehazes things. So I don't want to do that anymore. Vibrance, a little bit. Saturation, 2. I don't do much more than that. And we can hit that backslash key to see the before and the after. So there we are. That's how it looks right now. Pretty good. Now, let's work on the sky. Local area adjustments. You've got 3 of them across the top. You got the graduated filter, the radial filter, and the little brush. I often go first for the graduated or the radial because they're very fast and easy, and I'm a little lazy. I like fast and easy. So I'm going to grab and drag out on my image. Because I've chosen the linear filter or the graduated filter, as I drag down from the top, it sets up 3 lines for me. And you get this overlay. Let me do Shift-O and get the red. I think the red is a little bit more visible. So how this works. As soon as I click this tool, I got this new panel right here. This is the effect panel for this local area adjustment. It looks a lot like the basic panel, but it's different. Notice the basic panel is still down here. But this is the panel for the local area adjustment. And because I dragged from the top down, I'm now affecting above where I dragged. And you've got 3 lines. The way it works is this effect is applied 100% to the top line. Then it starts to fade out to 50% at the center line and then 0% at the bottom line. You control the width of this fade by grabbing either the beginning line or the end line and dragging it like so. So I'm just click and drag to adjust the width of the fade, not the graduated filter itself. You drag the center line to decide how much of the image you want to cover. In this case, I'm off at this kind of cockeyed angle. You can put your cursor over the center line, grab it near the edges, and that allows you to tilt like so. So let's straighten it a little bit. Yeah, we're going to run into some problems here. If you're paying attention, you're like, well, you're hitting the mountains and the sky. What do you want to do here? So that's a great question. So let's back it up a little bit and hit as little of the mountains as possible. If you don't have this red overlay, that is the Shift-O key will switch you between your different overlays. Just tapping O turns it off and on. Should have said that first. Tap O turns it off and on. Shift-O cycles it through its various colors. I like red and green often because they're very noticeable and they're very different from any edits that you might make on this image. There's a white one and there's a dark one, and sometimes you can kind of get mixed up and forget you even have them on. I'm going to turn it back off for a second, and now you are left with nothing. The edits that I've done so far to this local area adjustment are incredibly slight, and they're left over from the last time I made an edit. What I want to do is come up to the effect and double click it. That resets all of these to 0. Now let's be really drastic for a moment and drop this exposure slider down. So now you can see that I've kind of made a space black up there in the top half of the document, or the corners, and it comes down onto the mountains, and you know, it's not very realistic. You can adjust that, of course, as I said, like so. And notice how those clouds really start to show up when you do bring the exposure down up there in the sky. So I'm really going to try to figure out how to find that sweet spot to bring that down. But we don't want it to be just drastic like that. So let's bring the sky down a little bit. And let's bring the highlights down a little. And let's see what happens. The shadows, notice how you really see the shadows on the land. The darker landscape being covered by this local area adjustment is really picking that up. So we want to leave that alone. And texture and clarity on the sky, I think you could go either way. And this is a great tip that I want you to know. I don't always know which way I want to move the sliders. Sometimes I start moving them to see how the image responds. How do these clouds look a little bit softer with dropped texture? Well, I think they look kind of nice. How do they look a little crisper, where the detail really shows up? I think they look kind of nice. I have to decide which way I like them better. Maybe down a little bit. The way my friend Steve says it often is he really likes to often soften the sky a bit because it's a great contrast in texture against your hard, crispy land, as we have here with all of these rocks and sharp bits of pines. It's a nice contrast, and that sets up for a nice dynamic in the image. So I'll bring those down a little bit. Clarity, I don't know. Saturation, I'm very gentle with saturation, but I might want to raise it a little bit here. So that's what I've done there. And I have to need to look over at the chat room from time to time and make sure everybody's doing okay. Thank you all so much for tuning in and watching live from wherever you are. I get right into the teaching and I forget to take some time. Sometime soon, I'm going to have one of these live shows where it's just totally relaxed. You all teach me things. I don't know what. Something. All right. And we don't need to mess with these right now down here. So we've made some progress on the sky. If we want to see the changes we've made using just the local area adjustment, we can turn off the graduated filter. And that's a nice way. We can, of course, do the before and after, but that's the whole thing. I want to see how am I working out here with this graduated filter. It's very easy for our eyes to kind of get adjusted and stuck to what we're seeing and maybe not realizing how much darker we've made this landscape over here on the left-hand side. So, you can turn that off and on and see that. Okay? Now, up here, we have the temp and the tint controls. And this is very similar to how I generally edit in the basic panel, which again, I go into more detail in the original workshop. I move through my sliders here, and then generally I come up to temp and tint and make some adjustments. Usually minor, because the white balance is usually pretty close to what I want. But what happens if we cheat a little bit and push this a little bit warmer? So we really start to take those colors that are showing up in the sky and give it a little help and push to go a little bit further. Let's see what it looks like if we also, well, I said warm it, but we're just adding red tint, and this is really technically warming it. Really kind of starts to get some nice colors up there. I don't like that dark exposure off on the left as much though, so I'm going to just bring this back up. All right. Now, we need to fix this over here and over here where it's hitting. Again, if I hit the O key to see that graduated filter hitting over in those spots, not good. So you have the brush tool. And I should say this too, I am teaching Lightroom Classic, the very latest version. If you have an older version, you may be missing some features and functionalities. And if you have Lightroom CC, you are missing some features and functionalities. Although in the editing itself, a lot is very, very similar there as well. So, all right, I have within this tool a brush. Don't get confused. There are the three tools across the top, right? Linear, radial, and a brush. Within the linear and the radial, you have an additional brush tool that allows you to erase. So right now, as we have it, this graduated filter comes down in an equal straight line all the way across my image. I don't like that. I don't want it on the mountains. So I can come in to the brush and erase. I could also, probably saving myself time, look at this. We have to erase over here and over here. No. Remember, I said I'm lazy. I don't want to do that. Let's bring it back up so it's off the mountain a bunch. And instead, let's just add it down below. I cover all of these little settings, size, feather, and flow in the handout, which is available to you at photorec.tv/Lightroom2, linked right down below. I'm going to set the flow to something low in the mid 30s. Think of this as a percent. So if I did 100, that would be the same as it is painted above this line. If I did 50, it would be the same as it's painted right around this line. And 30 should be somewhere in this general vicinity. Maybe I'll go even a little bit lower for the flow. I leave my density on 100. You can work with those two to be very precise, but I find it pretty much easiest to just adjust. Let's do 25. Okay, and now I can start to paint. And notice the green is showing up down here. And honestly, I'm painting with a light enough flow that I don't have to worry too much about hitting the mountains. But I have this really cool little feature on. It's called Auto Mask. I could tell you a long story about how I got in trouble in 4th grade when we were supposed to color the class Christmas tree, and I got a little impatient. But I'll just say Auto Mask is a fantastic way for you to stay within the lines, for Lightroom to figure out what the lines are and to help you stay inside of them. So if you notice, as long as I'm brushing and keeping the center of the brush above El Cap there, the green, even though the brush is going over El Cap, the green isn't hitting it. It's starting to a little bit up there. I got a little sloppy and went a little too far, and then Lightroom guessed, okay, I guess the line is a little further than I thought, but that is pretty powerful. And notice the more I brush, the darker the overlay gets. I am adding more. It's exactly as if you were spraying with a spray paint can. If you could magically say, when I push this little button down on the spray paint can and spray at 25% of full power, you know that when you pass back over, you'd have 50% covering of the paint, and then 75, and then 100. So that's exactly what's happening here. Every time I brush over the same area, I am adding a 25 flow brush stroke. Does that make sense? So, and I can kind of come up along here as well. My edits here are pretty soft, so my brushing can be pretty sloppy and not so precise. If your edits are more less nuanced and heavier, then you need to be very careful in your brushing because the difference between a dark brush stroke and a light brush stroke is really going to show up. All right, so I think I've added enough down in that general vicinity. I'll just add a little bit more real quick. Now I want to go to the erase tool. So you have 3 brushes, an A brush, a B brush, and an erase brush. It's just another brush. And I'm going to use the bracket keys to make that brush bigger. And I'm going to show you another trick. If you don't need Auto Mask, have it turned off, because Lightroom is doing a really hard, complicated calculation where it is figuring out what you are trying to brush on when Auto Mask is turned on, and it slows your computer down and it slows the brushing down, and sometimes it'll jump over areas that you want erased or brushed. So if you don't need it, turn it off. Now watch as I brush, it's just real quick. You can see that green going away. So I'm going to come over here and brush up the side of that mountain as well. So I took this graduated filter that had a very straight line, and now I have a not straight line. I have a nice line that follows this valley. And I'm doing this a little sloppy to kind of keep up with making sure this workshop has somewhat of a decent flow to it. Notice that there is a little bit of area that I've missed right up against the edges. Really be careful and watch for that. Don't allow yourself to do that. There's a couple ways to fix that. We could come in, we could zoom in and get really close. Hold spacebar down allows you to grab and move along. And you could switch back to the A brush and then really make sure that you're getting down into those trees and not missing out. We could switch back over to the eraser, turn Auto Mask on now, and come along these trees, and look how nicely it's removing itself from the trees, but not the sky. So this is really nice and powerful. I love it. And I use the graduated filter and the brush very, very often. Almost every image that I really care about, Z key will zoom us back out. Almost every image that I really care about, I'll do a graduated or some local area adjustment filters. So let's get the O off so that we can see our actual adjustment. Looks pretty good. Definitely a little bit of haloing along here, so I would need to go back and brush on that in a little bit more detail in those areas. But that's pretty nice. I'm pretty happy with that. Let's try warming it or adding a little bit even more tint. Just really kind of giving that some life. Not bad. Now, I would like to control the foreground a little bit more. So I want another graduated filter. We're going to repeat this on another image in just a minute, just to kind of give you the repetition that I really think you need to see this and feel this and understand it. So, sorry, I didn't mean to leave that tool. In this tool, if I mouse over, I see a pin. That pin represents that one graduated filter I've put down. I've got New, Edit, and Brush. If I click New, now when I come out, I can click and drag. This time I'm going to click and drag up to throw on another graduated filter. And this one, can you guess what I'm going to do? Well, I'm going to double click Effect to reset everything to 0. And let's bring exposure up so that we can see some more of this landscape. Let's warm it a little bit too. Because again, my eyes and my memory of this was that the foreground was a bit warmer as the sun was starting to bounce off El Cap and kind of fill in this valley. So again, real quick, let's just remind ourselves what this image looked like when we started and what we've got now. Pretty happy with that. All I did for this graduated filter was bring up exposure about a half of a stop, as we can see right there. Now, we have the same issue. If we hit O, we can see that this graduated filter is a straight line that comes up, misses part of the mountain, and gets too much of the valley sky. So we're going to go to the brush, and we're going to go to the eraser. And auto mask is on, sounds good. It's a pretty big eraser, sounds good. I'm just going to kind of come down along here and erase. You notice that it's not as smooth. That's auto mask being on. Notice that it jumped over a little bit of cloud there. That's auto mask again, guessing incorrectly. When it's useful, it's still worth it having it on. You might have to go back over some areas. But again, like now up here, I can just turn it back off because I don't need it for that section up there. And now let's go over to A brush. B brush and A brush, they're just different brushes you can set the size for. So A brush now I just made gigantic. B brush is this tiny little detailed brush. And you just click on it and adjust it and it will just remember. So they're kind of like favorited brush sizes. So again, I'm going to bring this much smaller. Bracket keys or that slider. And my flow is about 25. That sounds good. And I'm just going to brush up into the mountains here a little bit. One thing that I'm always pleasantly surprised at is how well nature and landscape can absorb some heavy editing. So even though I'm being really kind of sloppy up here, and that might be a bit heavier than the graduated filter is even down below, when you turn it off, you don't see that. It works. It works quite nicely. And so now here we are. And again, I saw a question in the chat that goes by when doing snow, how to keep it white and not gray, blue, or purple, or muddy. And the answer right here is, Jamie, with your temp and tint. And so right now, I feel like this still has just a little bit of cool blue cast to it, just a little. And I think I like that. But if you're running into issues, then you need to work with these two sliders here, or come down into, here, let's close this for a second, come down into the HSL color panel, find the color you'd like to remove. Let's say the blue is too much. Well, you can lower the saturation of the blue. So you can see that there's a lot of blue in this image still, and bringing it down just a little bit can fix that, and bringing luminance up can kind of wash out that blue. So you get a little bit more of that nice white color. But really you want to spend most of your time in that temp and tint section to work on your white balance. So this looks good. People like this. I think this is a pretty nice image. I believe if you go back on my Instagram a ways, I took this a lot farther on Instagram and really warmed it up. Now notice, let's push it all the way. Let's be dramatic. We've pushed both of these all the way over here, and there's a point at which, I don't think it looks great, but that's an example of what you could do. Now, if you've pushed it all the way and it's, oh look, we missed a little spot of, where'd it go? A little spot of green over here and over here. You can right click on one of these and duplicate it. This is also where you can delete. A lot of times people get into trouble. In my actual live in-person workshops, I move a little bit slower. I walk around the room to make sure people are doing all right. And when we first dive into the local area adjustments, sometimes I'll come across somebody who has a ton of graduated filters on their page. Ooh. Wow, we just created some kind of, I think there's a volcano that erupted on the other side of Half Dome. This is a very different scene. And they're like, help, I've got all of these pins. What am I doing? And the easy way to get rid of them is to find the pin, and with it selected, you can simply press the delete key on the keyboard, or you can right click on it and choose delete. So that's the easy way to get back out of there. If you've done a terrible mess of everything and you need to say, starting all over on this type of local area adjustment, you can hit the reset tool, and that will take away all local area adjustments of that type. So all graduated filters. You say, oh, Toby, you just undid all your work. Well, of course, you can come back to the delete adjustment, the history over here on the left-hand side that will give you all of the ability, that gives you the ability to step back through time in all of those as well. So, yeah. All right. And Linda asks, how do you turn the graduated filter on and off to compare? Once again, if you missed that, Linda, it's this tiny little switch right here at the bottom of the panel of the local area adjustment, and that will turn any of that type of graduated filters off. Now, I keep saying of that type. Let's do this for a second. That was the extra one, right, in this one. And let's duplicate that real quick. That's a quick, oh, that's the bottom one. Let's get the one down into the valley, right? Yeah. So that's how you can quickly duplicate to really get a powerful effect. This, to me, is way over edited, especially the fact that it's not erased over here on the sides now. So you got to keep that in mind. But let's say, for instance, that we, delete, that we really didn't love how that worked. So we've got the land brighter, but let's try another attempt on the sky, not with the graduated filter, but with the radial filter, just because I want to really kind of show you how this works. We're going to move to another image in a minute and show you a different way to make this work. So you grab this and drag out, and it is very similar to the linear gradient, except you just got one line. That one line represents the outer edge or the inner edge of the filter. It's weird to me, but by default, Lightroom does the outside of what you've just drawn. So you can see through the green overlay right now that everything outside of my circle is going to be affected. I want the inside of the circle to be affected. This is another way of tackling an irregular shaped sky, as skies usually are. All right, I'm going to hit the invert key right here. This little check mark. Now, if I hover over this so that the overlay shows up, you can see that it is, in fact, inside this circle. So the effect is 100% right here around the center, and then it fades out to 0 at the outer line. You have control not with lines about that fade, but with the feathering tool right here. Let's be really drastic for a moment. Super dark. You can feather it so that there's no feathering, and you get some kind of weird art project like that. Or that there is very, very gradual soft feathering out to 100. You can see that the effect really is only at the center, and it very quickly starts to fade out. Typically around 50, which is the default setting, and then I just move the size of this a bit. So let's do the same thing though. We did those things, and I thought texture and clarity down a little bit looked nice, and we're just kind of warming up the sky area. And same stuff. I'm going to go over to the brush tool, erase tool. Let's hit O so we can see. Auto mask is on, so I'm going to make this brush even bigger. As long as the center is inside this area, erase tool. Even bigger, here we go, and auto mask on. So now I can quickly erase off of that land, because I'm keeping most of the brush inside the land area. It comes off nicely. So go ahead and make the brush nice and big when you need to quickly work through areas. But then when you're working on little details, take the time to make it even a little bit smaller. So now we hit the O key again, and we can see that it's the same result, but we just arrived at it at a slightly different way. Now, if we turn this off and on, it's just the sky that changes, because the sky is affected by the radial filter. The landscape is affected by the graduated filter. So we can see that change there. Makes sense? And then finally, let's take this away from the sky. So the sky is back to its normal. We can go to the brush tool. The brush tool is the same idea, except you physically brush on exactly where you want this graduated filter, or exactly where you want this local adjustment to be. So I want to affect the sky. Auto mask is on. Flow at 25. Sounds good. And we just start to paint. And we hit O to see where we've painted. With just 25 and going fairly quickly, you can see that it's a pretty light coating. So let me repaint with a little bit more patience. And again, it might look like, and it's true, the parts of the cloud are getting skipped. Lightroom with auto mask turned on is trying to guess, and for whatever reason feels like those are outside the lines. I'm going to turn auto mask off for a second, and you'll see that those will quickly get painted over. But you want to be very careful about your edges then, because it's easy with auto mask turned on, with auto mask turned off to go over the lines. So now I'll turn it on and I'll do my pass down here along the edge to kind of fill that in a little bit more, like so. And we hit O, and we can make our adjustments. We hadn't made any adjustments yet. We were just looking at the overlay. So we can warm that up. We can bring that exposure down, and you can start to see that we've got some really nice control. Again, when it really matters, and this is a special image to you, please watch for the telltale, cheap editing, lazy editing signs of halos along the edges. You want to take the time and really get in there with a small brush and paint that carefully through there. Vanessa wants to know, when you hit O, do you have to do something prior to hitting O or shift and O? No. When a local area adjustment is selected, O will turn on and show selected mask overlay. And down here in the bottom left corner, my person might be over it. So my person, me. Let's go to just screen. Show selected mask overlay. This is the same thing. So if you can't remember the O key, you can just click this and that will show you. You can also show edit pins set to auto, I think is best. You can say always selected and never. Never they're going to hide from you, and it's going to be really hard to find them. You say, I just did a local area adjustment here. Where can I find the pin? That's the trick down there. Auto is best. Kind of shows up when you hover near it. Otherwise, it goes away, so it's not distracting you with these little gray spots in the sky. That's the same thing right there. Show selected mask overlay or not. And the O key will turn that on. What Shift O does is it cycles through the different colors available to you. There's a green, that's a white, that's a black, that's a red, and that's a green. So 4 colors total that are available to you for the overlay, kind of giving you an idea. Again, I like the green or the red because they're very different than what you're seeing in nature and what you're putting down, so that can help as well. Any questions about that? So I talk a lot about the graduated filter and the radial filter and the adjustment brush in detail on these. And then I've got helpful tips with all local adjustments. Those are listed right here in the packet on page 4. And now I want to talk a little bit about the range mask. This was added within the last, 2 years now. So it's not that new of a feature, but it is incredibly powerful, and I run into so many people that aren't using it. Let's move on to another image. This is the image that I've put out as the challenge image. So if you're watching live, this image is available to you along with these other ones I'm working on. But this one, I would love for you to download, make some edits to, and pass back to me. You can find out all of that information by going to photorec.tv/Lightroom2. There's the link to download these pictures, and then there's a link to submit back to me a JPEG of your edits. And so I'm going to start editing right now on this image. And again, I'm not going to start with local area adjustments. I always just start with general adjustments. Very same story, or very similar story to this as the Yosemite one. I was being careful and underexposing a bit so that I didn't lose any of the detail in the clouds. Those were a little bit bright up there, and so I underexposed. That cost me some of the detail down here, but what you will find, and this is somewhat camera dependent, but generally you will find that you are able to bring out the detail in the shadows quite easily. Don't do more than you need to as far as underexposing, because then there's going to be more noise hiding in those shadows than you need, but just a little bit. So I'm just going to raise exposure just a bit, and you can see we're starting to lose some of that detail in the sky. So I'm going to stop around there. Contrast, I always add a little bit of contrast. Highlights, well, that's what I'm trying to protect, so I'm going to bring these back down. And you can see how much detail there is in the sky because I was careful not to let that overexpose. So somewhere around there. Shadows, yeah, let's bring these shadows up. And you start to notice some things in this image when I do. One, there's a person right here. two people actually in my shot. There's some little branch that looks like an animal to me sticking up here, a little snake head thing, and then there's a part of a railing. This is the parking lot, the edge of the parking lot of the Human History Museum in Zion National Park. So those are some things we'll need to fix in a few moments, and I'll show you how to do that. The whites, I'm going to hold down Shift and double-click white to see what Lightroom thinks is the automatic setting for that. It's okay. I'm going to bring it back a little bit. It's just, again, personal preference. Hold down Shift and double-click on blacks to see what Lightroom thinks, and it brought it down a little bit. I agree with that. Texture, I'm going to bring up a bit. I really want to start to bring the texture out in that sandstone of those Zion mountains there. Clarity up a bit. Dehaze, I don't know. Let's see what happens when we start to raise the dehaze. You get more detail out of the sky, and I think I like a little dehaze. Vibrance, I almost always add a bit. Again, vibrance is the more muted colors that it's starting to bring to life. And then saturation, let's just 2, 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there. Real quick, the analogy we often use when teaching about saturation, all of these in the presents, they all are your salt. And a little bit of salt can really make a dish taste wonderful, can bring out the flavors of a dish. Too much salt, and it's going to taste nasty. Too much of any one of those, it's going to make your picture look nasty. But a little bit can really make it pop nicely. Okay, now I think you know where we're going here. We want to affect the sky. I showed you how to do that before. I'm going to grab the graduated filter. Some of you might be saying, well, wait a second. Why don't I just brush on? That's a lot of brushing. I don't want to do that. And I'm going to show you a technique that's going to make your life better. So I'm going to grab this graduated filter and I'm going to drag it down over most of the mountains. Hit the O key. There it is. There's the green that's affecting the top half of my image. And I'm angling it because, well, I think you can see we have the amount of sky kind of angles from left to right, less to more. All makes sense. There was just a little bit of color in the sky, so I kind of want to bring that warmth back here as well, and maybe a little bit more color. And what do I think? I thought the texture looked nice going that way, or does the dehaze? Yeah, a little bit of that. That looks good. And I'll have to actually say, the way the mountains look with a little bit more warmth on them, just warming that and raising the red tint, looks quite nice, and the texture and the clarity as well. What happens if we go the other way with texture? They look nice that way as well. Let's just do that to be different. Now you can see that the tops of those mountains got soft. So of course we could move over to our brush, and within the brush we can erase, hit the O, we can start to brush, we can use the auto mask. All good, right? Sure. But even better, let's get off the brush, is the range mask. So I talk about this in great detail in the packet. This is incredibly powerful. You have the ability to say, Lightroom, take this graduated filter or radial filter or even brush and limit it by a set of guidelines, a color or colors or a brightness value. Let's do luminance first. This seems complicated. You got these little sliders, but it's not. It really isn't. So what we want to look at here is the range that we have the ability to constrain this graduated filter to goes from 0, think of that as black, to 100, think of that as white. This isn't the colors, I use black and white, but that's darkness or brightness values. So 0 is the darkest parts of the image, 100 is the brightest parts of the image. And if we move this slider, we can constrain, let's come back to a little bit of me so you can see my hand motions. We can constrain and say, hey, I only want this mask to be on the brighter part of the image, the top 50% of it. Or I only want it to be on the darker, the bottom 50. Watch. We grab this and we start to drag it over. Notice how it peels off the mountain. And we can go quite far. And we end up with just the sky in that 95 to 100. Yeah, that makes sense, right? The sky is the brighter part of the image. It was the highlights that I was protecting. So now we are just protecting the brighter parts of the image. There's an additional show luminance mask that you can do. Put your image into a black and white mode, and no matter what overlay you're using, the mask is shown now in red. And so you can see that we've peeled the red off the mountains. We didn't have to brush. We didn't have to even mess with auto mask. As wonderful as auto mask is, it still would have taken some time. It automatically for us is so nicely painted over all of that. And look, I come way down here and there's nothing down here that gets hit by that mask. It just instantly, nicely follows the curve, every little nook and cranny of those mountains up there. And we can, let's back it back a little bit until we really start to see the red just starting to show up on the mountains. So it's actually somewhere in the mid-80s range that we are saying the sky is the 83% to 100% brightness value in this image. Smoothness is how picky you are about how much it flows over into the other colors. So smoothness 100, it's like, yeah, man, you're all a good brightness value. Smoothness 0 is very, very constrained to exactly your range. I usually leave smoothness around the 50 mark and just simply move my range to fit. Let's say we bring it down a little bit more. It can hit the sky a little, or no, actually we want to go the other way. We want it to be a little bit more in all parts of the sky. We click Show Luminance Mask. It's off. And now what we do up here is just going to affect the sky. And notice that the mountains are getting hit a little bit, but not nearly as much as the sky. So we can come back down to the range and say, all right, well, the overlay lied to us a little bit. Let's be a little bit more precise with it, like so. And there's other ways to work this. So let's get a new graduated filter. Let's drag up from the bottom this time. And here we are on these mountains. Hit O. Let's go all the way past those mountains. And we can have a steep like so. We really want to affect these mountains. Now, let's do something like, let's brighten them. Let's increase the texture, clarity, a little bit of saturation, warm them up. So those mountains are really starting to pop. Let's remind ourselves what this image looked like when we first opened it, or this is without any graduated filters at all. And then after, not bad, but a lot of that effect is going into the hills, or sorry, up into the sky as well. So what we want to do is come down to our range mask. This time we'll try color. And we're going to get another image that we'll work on in a minute that helps us kind of see exactly what's happening here. So now we are asking Lightroom to not limit it by a range of brightness or tones, but a color. And so in this case, we could just simply grab the dropper and click on our sandstone rocks. And now it has constrained it. The only thing that happens here now is that you don't get a range mask overlay. You just simply have to use the regular overlay. So look at how nice a job it did. It's really confined to the landscape now. I'm not sure why it's picking up down here as well, but I think that's part of the funniness of the overlay. Well, here's the issue with the range mask color. It's very precise. We clicked once, so it picked up only that color I picked. Luckily, you can click more than once. Hold down Shift. You get a little plus sign next to the dropper, so we can click again and again and try to pick all of these different colors. And you'll start to add all of that area to it. You can see that we're missing that right there. There, he selected that. Notice now, however, though, as I add a new dropper, the old ones disappear, cycling through. You can have a total of, how many are on the page? 5. 5 droppers total. The other option you have is to click and drag to draw a box. And then it's going to sample the colors within that box. That's probably the easiest way to do it, unless you want to be really, really precise. And again, you've got this amount slider, very similar to the slider in the other one. It allows you to really precisely say just the colors I clicked on or a little bit more than the colors I clicked on. And so now we can really see that you can really kind of adjust the warmth of those up there. And notice that we have some adjustment down below, but not nearly as much because we are limiting that mask to those color areas there. Make sense? I think that's incredibly powerful. Let's do it on one more image real quick. And again, well, actually, yeah, we'll come back to this with a couple other things. This image right here, a little bit of waterfall at Zion National Park from our recent workshop there. It happened to be rainy and snowy, and it was the wettest I've ever seen it at Zion. I'm going to hit auto just to kind of brighten this a lot. It was quite dark, and 3-second exposure gave this nice water coming out of here, that silky smooth look. I think it brightened it more than I want. Let's bring it down. I really want the green of the trees to pop. Graduated filter. Drag it up over the trees and bring the tint down. So they really start to get green. But if you look carefully, the water's starting to pick up that green as well. That's not great. I don't want that. So I'm going to come over to Range Mask, Color. I'm going to grab the dropper, and I'm just going to drag and drop through a section of the tree. And now we hit O. Do I have to put it back? Oh, it's being less picky than in my sample. Well, there we go. Okay. So maybe I'm selecting from just a little bit too large of an area. And now let's bring our amount down. There we go. Look at that. So that's the range mask that's making them so green. But you are able to do an incredibly complex mask by just throwing the graduated filter on, or radial filter, or brush, and then simply saying, limit to this color. It's awesome and really powerful. So, I mean, yeah, let's take the overlay off. Let's bring this back to something normal. I could bring the texture up a bit, clarity and a little bit of saturation. What did this look like before we affected it? So not a huge difference, but the trees definitely get sharper and a little bit more green. And we could do the same thing at the top half of the image, you know, if we wanted to run over that, really kind of warm that up a bit, and texture and clarity. But we don't want the falls itself. We want to kind of keep that nice. So let's go to luminance, and let's limit it to the darker parts of the image and show range mask. You can see that it peels off that water pretty quickly. That's the brighter part of the image, and it constrains itself to the darker bits of the rock. We could bring those up after we say show luminance mask, like so. And overall, the image looks straight out of camera, like that, and then after a little bit of editing, like so. That makes sense? Sean wants to know, for the final detail editing, do you use a pen like Wacom or just a mouse? I use just a mouse. There definitely is benefits to a Wacom tablet. If I did a lot of portraiture work, I would probably invest in a Wacom tablet, but I don't. Speaking of portrait work, let's see. Other questions? I think we've got them. Kathy wants to know, should you delete an older backup catalog? Kathy, if you have other backup versions, if that's a subsequent backup, yes. You really only need 1 or 2 older backup versions. You don't need to keep 10 or 15 of them. Certainly can delete those older catalogs. Okay. I want to go over another way that you might not think of to use a graduated or local area adjustment as much. I've got this nice banana salesman from a Cuba trip several years ago. Really nice guy. He was quite happy to have his photo taken, and then I bought a few bananas. First thing I'm going to do real quick is just kind of crop in a little bit because I think the story is all about him and his face. In this image, I didn't capture enough of the bananas to be interesting. So I don't want to cut off his hat. So somewhere around here. I'm going to hit auto again just to see where auto goes. Let's remind ourselves, straight out of camera, auto. Just brought down the exposure up in the sky a little bit with the highlights. That looks good. I really like the details in his face, a little weathered. I want to emphasize that a little bit. I'm going to grab the graduated filter, the radial filter, and draw it over his face. Maybe make it a little bit bigger and invert it so that it is affecting inside, right? And now let's brighten the face a bit. Let's add some contrast. Let's add some texture and clarity. And typically when you're working with portraiture, you actually often want to go the other way. Smooth skin a little bit. Make him look a little younger. But this guy, he's got some character to his face, and I want to emphasize that with a little bit more texture. This is actually why the texture slider, one of the reasons texture slider was added to Lightroom, was mostly for portrait photographers to do a little bit of skin softening. That's another philosophical discussion we can have someday. I'm not a huge fan of over softening skin. And that's why I like this example, because I'm actually going the other way. Just adding a few years to his age. I know that's cruel, but I did buy some bananas. All right. Just that simple. And also let's bring up the shadows a little bit, so that just a little bit more detail that's hiding under that hat there. And if we want to see what it looked like before and after. Now let's say that you did want to decrease his age a little bit. You wanted to drop texture and smooth out some of those sliders. And you could also drop clarity a little bit. Notice that you start to soften the eyes. Well, that's where you get your brush tool. You hit your eraser and you come in and you just erase right around the eye area so that those stay nice and sharp while the skin is softened just a little bit. So you can see kind of before and after. I use radial filters often with subjects to kind of highlight them, to throw a little bit of extra light on it. That's creepy looking, I know, sorry. But that's a great example of how well this works. You could also erase it off the lips if you still wanted some really nice sharp definition to the lips as well. I had a picture that I put up in Pen a few months ago that showcases this exact technique on a little red squirrel that was sitting in a tree. The light was a little bit flat, but through the use of a radial filter, I was able to brighten and darken and soften, brighten the subject, sharpen the subject, and soften the background. Let me show you that. So I've got this filter on him. Let's go back to where we wanted to, texture and clarity up. Now I'm going to right click and duplicate. I'm going to, you can see it gets a little too strong for my taste. That might look nice as a black and white, but we're not going to talk about that right now. I'm going to actually invert this, drop texture and clarity, and now the background and around him becomes just that much more kind of ethereal. I overdid it for this example so you can really see. But this is a nice way where if you felt like maybe the detail in the background is a little too distracting, you can pick out objects, throw that radial gradient over it, sharpen your subject, and a second radial gradient that's affecting the outside, soften. And then you really kind of have your subject stand out from the background. Looks good. Jamie wants to know, how much noise does it introduce when the image starts that dark? It all depends on what ISO you're using, what your camera is. Jamie, I know you have a Sony. Backside illuminated sensors like the ones that Sony has, Nikon as well, are usually, you can start pretty dark and bring it up. But the simplest answer is never expose darker than you need to, because then you are just going to introduce more noise. How much more? It all depends back to your sensor. Okay. All right. That was a look at local adjustments, and we spent a good bit of time on it, but they really are useful. Now, I want to move on to the Transform panel, because this is another one that I think is really useful that people often overlook. We're going to start with a very, yes, this is how you would use the Transform panel, but I'll encourage you to consider some other aspects of using this as well. So we're done with local area adjustments for now. We're going to come down here to the Transform panel, and we've got off, auto, guided, level, vertical, full. These are buttons. They look like buttons, and they are buttons. Let's press auto and see what happens. In general, when you look at this image, the church is leaning back away from me, and it's slightly at an angle. Can't tell if that was because I'd been drinking or because the church is old and slightly at an angle now. The reason it's leaning back is I shot this with a 16mm lens on a full frame camera, and so you get a very keystone effect. All right, let's see what auto does. Not bad. It certainly reduced that keystone effect. You can see that it introduced some other issues, though, of course, that we have edges that are now showing because, well, Lightroom can't make up new content. Lightroom is not able to do that. We'll show in Photoshop in a few minutes how you can. So you want to reduce that. You can hit Constrain to Crop, and it will crop out any of the edges that it shouldn't have. Level, vertical, full. All right, let's go back to off and then guided. And guided makes this little tool come to life. This is a button and a tool as well. Lightroom likes to hide some of these little tools around. Actually, what we need to do real quick is go back here and hit reset. There we go. This tool gives you lines that you can draw on the photo on corners and edges that should be straight, should be vertical or horizontal. Maybe I'm not explaining myself so well, so I'll just show you. First thing, this outer edge of the bell tower, that should be straight up and down. So I'm going to draw a line along it, and Lightroom says, okay, he's tracing this line mostly vertically. I'm going to go ahead and make it all the way vertical, but not yet. Lightroom needs at least 2 of these lines. Now I'm going to find something horizontal that represents what should be horizontal. So for instance, right here, this middle step runs right along there. I'm going to draw a long line along that and say that should be horizontal. It's pretty close to it. But using 2 of these together now, Lightroom is going to straighten this up. Well, you can see it's leaning off to the left now. So let's do another one that's over here on that edge of the building. And maybe, since it gives me 4, let's do one more up here at the top. And we can see that we have a little bit more. And we hit constrain to crop. And, well, a bummer is we lose a lot of this image. This is a great lesson in that you can fix certain things, but if you don't have a lot of room around the image with a wider angle lens, you may lose it. So let's go back to the crop tool and say, okay, well, we can change the crop of this image so that we lose less. Let's take the aspect ratio lock off, and let's see if we can figure out a spot to kind of get all of it all the way down. I talk in detail in the original Lightroom workshop from a few weeks back. There we go. It's a little tight for my taste, but we nicely fixed that, and there it is. I did mean to have another image, a more natural image to include where you can do some transforming. Let's just throw it in this one real quick. I'm going to go to guided, got that tool active. And let's say that this line of rocks should be horizontal and this should be vertical right about there. And boom, it twists and warps the image a little bit so that it gives me what I want. There are a handful of times as I go through my favorite landscape images where because of the slope of the horizon or the angle of the mountains, it has this off-kilter feel to it. And using this can just slightly tweak that and really make it a bit more powerful in its impact and feel like those mountains are really just kind of rising straight up, which they are. And so this is more true to life in a lot of ways than not. And notice I only needed to use 2 there. I could put more down, like, this is straight over here, but, I don't really think it's going to make much of a difference. You don't necessarily need to use more than you do. Does that make sense? All right. So, we'll still come back to this. Well, let's stay in this one. This is nice. Using those local area adjustments, I added a bit of texture and clarity to the landscape. Where is my sky one? This was my sky one. It comes down so low, and I brought that texture and texture and clarity down. Well, now we're going to talk about page 9 of 12 of the handout, the detail panel. And I'm not going to go into this a ton. I don't want you to overstress about sharpening and noise reduction. You should certainly work in this panel a little bit with your images that really matter to you, but I don't want you to go crazy about this for a couple of reasons. One, the sharpening tools in Lightroom are easy to overdo it. And 2, the noise reduction is, easy to overdo. They're both easy to overdo. I'll tell you this. These settings that you see right here, an amount of about 40, a radius of 1.0, and a detail of 25, those numbers and those values are my default sharpening. And I've actually started to work this into my import preset. So I was a little, I fudged a little when I said, here's my great import preset, here's what I do with it. I actually do have this detail and the sharpening in it as well. And it's very easy for you to update. You can make these adjustments. You can come over to your import preset. You can right click on it and say update with current settings. And then just make sure the detail panel is checked as well. Pen members, I'll do a tutorial about that very soon. Sharpening, I will go up higher to 60. This is an incredibly personal preference, I think. But it's just so easy to go too far with sharpening and have an image that looks over sharpened. I don't know how to say that any other way. It looks over sharpened with, notice that we're starting to get a little bit of halo around the edges of that image. And I don't love that. So I stay away from over sharpening. And I have some other methods of sharpening that I'll talk about in a minute. But basically sharpening looks for contrasty bits. And it emphasizes those so that you notice them more. Radius is how far outside of those contrasty bits should it look and apply sharpening. 1 is within 1 pixel. If you go higher than that, those edges are going to get thicker and more noticeable. So again, if you watch, we just move this to the right. You can really see those mountains start to pop. It's pretty subtle. And this is why I say don't stress a whole lot about it. Dial in some settings that you like, and then for the most part, unless it's your very highest 5-star images or images that are going to go to print and print large, then that is when you really do want to work on sharpening a bit. Detail is kind of this mystical panel. The more detail, the smaller the detail it's going to latch onto. Let's leave this image for just a second because this snowy, frosty pine with pine cones is a great example. Right next to the detail window is a little target icon. You grab that, you bring it over to a part of your image that you really want to watch carefully, that detail increase or decrease. So I'm going to click right there. And I'm going to increase that sharpening. And you're going to be able to see it change in that little window. You can also go 1-to-1 on the bigger image as well to see that detail appear. Note though, especially with images with a bit of noise in them, the higher you increase the detail, the edges of the noise are going to get enhanced and make your image noisier as well. So you want to watch out for that, and there's a way to deal with that in just a second. So maybe in this image I can go up to 60 or so. I love there's a tiny little snowflake caught up there that's just a little out of focus. Sharpening doesn't fix that. And I make a note of this in the handout as well. There are some other programs where if you find yourself sharpening often and frustrated with Lightroom's kind of soft approach, it's either like can't really tell a whole lot has happened or you feel like you've overdone it. There are other programs like Topaz Sharpen that might do a better job for you, or Photoshop as well. All right, so radius detail is really where you could start to, if you bring detail all the way up, you can start to see a little bit more happen in the pine cone, but not a whole lot. Masking, that's how you make sure that it's really only affecting the areas of the image that you want. So I'm going to drag the masking up. You can't really see anything in this image change. Let's zoom back in. This image was shot at ISO 320, pretty low ISO. It's not very noisy. And changing the masking really doesn't feel like it's changing anything. If you hold down the Alt and drag this, it will give you this nice black and white view where you can start to see there is some noise in the sky. How this view works is what is pure black is not being sharpened. You're masking that out. So I want to bring this up until all of that sky or just the area around the pine needles and the pine cones is masked out. There's no reason for sharpening to be applied there. So not only will that help this stand out a little bit more because only the part you want is being sharpened, but it also makes sure that you're not increasing noise in areas of your image that you don't want. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, related to that is this whole little noise reduction panel, and I talk about this in the packet as well. By default, I have my noise reduction set to 0 because I don't want noise reduction to happen on images unless I want them. Sharpening, almost every image needs my default sharpening settings, in my opinion, because what happens for most of us when we're capturing our images with our cameras actually blur the images a teeny tiny bit to avoid things like moire, which is that repeating pattern and finely, a kind of optical illusion in finely repeating patterns. So, but noise reduction, I might not have much noise. And this is also another one where I don't want you to stress and agonize. Even if you spend a lot of money on a camera, there are going to be times where you zoom in, and even at ISO 100, there's going to be noise. There's just going to be. It just happens. And even if you underexpose, there'll be a little bit more. So noise reduction, it's a very delicate balance between smooshing detail out to get rid of noise and smooshing detail out to that you end up with getting rid of detail. So you want to walk that line very carefully. I have, do I give you some base numbers in here? I don't think I do, because I don't really have them. Luminance, I just move it up on noisy images, watching very carefully on my subject for a loss of detail. As soon as I see that, then I'll back it up a little bit. Color is the noisier color that you might get in lower light situations where it's splotchy. You get little bits of red and purple and magenta, all kind of bunched together as grain. That's your color noise that you often get in lower exposure images. So that's another spot. And I'll point out to you, if you come back to the brush tool or any of the local area adjustments, you do have a noise slider. And the slider works, I think, backwards than most people would expect. If you take it to 100, that is 100 noise reduction. So in this image, if I had issues with more noise all around, I could paint this on. And again, hit the O key to see where I'm painting. Let's up the flow. There we go. So, and I have auto mask turned on, don't I? Yes, I can tell because there's a lag to the brushing. That's a downside of auto mask. So now, all of this area that I've brushed is going to be noise reduced at a level of 100. In this case, it didn't really need it, but it really makes sure that it's nice and clean, and I know that I'm not affecting any of the details in the area of my image. And notice that you also have sharpness. So this is a kind of more general slider. So we say new, and let's bring the sharpness up, and now paint on the subject area. And now I am affecting just that. So we're back to these local area adjustments being really powerful. Not only can we control exposure and texture and clarity and temp and tint as we have been doing, but you can also use them to reduce noise or to increase the sharpness. But again, these tools are a little bit limited because you really just have one slider here, sharpness and noise. And it's not as detailed down as the panel. But then on the other hand, it allows you to pick exactly where you're editing so that you can kind of work through that. All right. Now, let's talk about going to Photoshop. And I think we're caught up on questions. I haven't seen any in a bit. So if you have questions, make sure you're putting them into the chat so that we can have them. A lot of people talking about their weather. It's good. Nice. Okay. Let's go back to my the Zion picture right here. Oop. I didn't mean to actually put that local area adjustment down, so I'm just going to click on the little pin and delete. Now, I've done a bit to this, and I want to do a little bit more. I'm going to crop now. I often will crop early on in the process, but let's just see what happens. Oh, I want to hit A to take the aspect ratio off. We're going to go to Photoshop with this image, and I'm just going to decide, do I like it with a little less foreground? I don't know. I like a bit of that foreground. It's just the railing I was trying to get rid of and some of the other things. So maybe let's come back. Now, Lightroom does have the Q tool, which is your clone and heal tool. I talk about this in the other image, the other workshop a little bit. So these people back here, I could click on that. But notice that Lightroom is very limited in what it can do. All it can do is grab from somewhere else in this image and kind of paste over the subject or objects that I want to get rid of. It's limited. It can't make any new pixels. That's not how Lightroom works. Lightroom is a non-destructive editor. It can only lay instructions on top, do things like say, hey, take a sample from over here and try to match it. The heal tool will try to match the tones. So you notice how if I pull from way up here, for instance, it's not going to be red like the rocks, but it is the texture of the rocks. Let's zoom in a little bit, but it turns it green. So, and let's put it in the sky for a second. So you can move that sample wherever, but then we have that low texture sky, and the texture in the sky is very soft. So that's mildly useful. And over here we get this railing. We can kind of just scribble over top of it, and it samples from over there. And well, honestly, if you weren't looking hard at the corner, you probably wouldn't really notice. But that's not the way you want to go about things. You don't want to edit in a way and say, well, I hope nobody looks too closely at that. Yeah, that's not a great strategy for your editing in general. So we're going to take this to Photoshop. And I want to talk about this in here because I love editing in Lightroom. It's fast, it's efficient, and it holds this history right here. I was recently on the web design workshop, went back and found some of my very favorite old pictures, and some of them I wanted to re-edit because my skills have increased, Lightroom has increased. Some pictures I edited before there was a texture slider or before the range mask was a thing. And so being able to go back and work on them was really nice. And any of the images that I had done all my work in Lightroom on, that was great because it meant the history was there. Even if these were images from, gosh, 2014. I know, 6 whole years ago. That history was still there, and I could back it up a little bit, or I could redo all of it, and it was great. There are some images where I've gone to Photoshop with, and Photoshop offers some really nice, powerful features that we'll look at in a minute. But the downside is when you come back from Photoshop, you now have a separate file. So you have 2 files now, the original in Lightroom and a second copy made in Photoshop. And so when I came across those files, if I wanted to do more editing, well, I can certainly edit the Photoshop file, but I'm kind of stuck from the point at which I went to Photoshop. I can't go back in time. Or I could go back to the original, but then anything I did to it in Photoshop, I would have to do again. So there's a lot to be said for trying to stay in Lightroom. But let's look at what Photoshop offers, and it tempts you away from Lightroom fairly often, in my case. All right, it's really easy to get to Photoshop from Lightroom. You right-click and say Edit in Photoshop. Now, I'll click that, and we'll wait a minute as it loads up. When it loads up in Photoshop, it loads up as the raw file, and you have a camera raw control in Photoshop that is identical to Lightroom. Optically, it's a little visually, the interface is a little different, but you have all of the same tools. They're all there in Photoshop as well. But it just looks a little bit different. So keep that in mind. There are some people that really just use Lightroom as their digital asset manager, as their kind of keyword and organizer, and then they do all of their edits in Photoshop. I don't do that because I love the quick and easiness of editing in Lightroom. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. We could do lots of different things to this image. Photoshop, the latest version, is incredibly powerful. For instance, let's just for a moment just say select subject. What is our subject? Let's see if Lightroom knows. Well, it quickly masked or selected these mountains. Now, I'd like it to get more of them, so I can click this little tool, Object Selection. I can hold down Shift and drag through that and say, hey. And then Lightroom goes, oh, look, I want to grab a little, Photoshop goes, I want to grab a little bit more. And then you could just switch over to another tool and kind of grab through the lower half. Oop, I needed to hold down Shift. Grab through the lower half of the image. And now what could you do? Holy smokes, you could do all kinds of things. You could get into compositing. You could copy this and paste it. And look, boom. I just separated this image from its sky, simply by asking Lightroom to select the subject and then making a little bit of modification to it. Now I could put a starry night sky back there if I wanted. I don't personally do that. If this quarantine goes on longer, I might start. Who knows? But if that's your thing, this makes it so easy. And look what a good job it did. That is really nicely detailed in there. Command 0, get you back. Command minus, makes the image smaller or bigger, but that's not what we're talking about today. We don't want to talk about that. We'll leave that there though. I actually have two images now, right? I've got the original background layer that is the whole thing, and then sitting on top of it, I have just the mountains. We'll come back to that in a moment, which is kind of cool and powerful. All right, so we've got a lot of healing tools in here. The spot healing brush is a good one. The patch tool is another good one. But let's go to spot healing brush. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Bracket keys still. And I'm just going to paint over this section. And now Photoshop thinks about what's there, thinks about what's around it, and makes new content. It oftentimes will duplicate existing content in a way that's similar to Lightroom, but it is also truly generating new stuff. So there'll be this little bit of an overlap of repetition. If we look in down this corner now, we can see that this kind of branch messiness is repeated over there again. So we just kind of get that tool again and just kind of paint a little bit. And each time you paint, it'll just make something new. And usually when you start to get down this road in the weeds, literally in the weeds, it can look pretty rough. Like there's a lot of repetition going on there. Repetition of that level doesn't happen in nature. So you might want to back it up, Command Z, same as in Lightroom, until you get, until you get back to where you want. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So let's just try a little bit right here and a little bit right there. Yeah. That looks pretty good. Again, in this purposes, don't look too close. And these people over here, let's click on them. Yeah. Yeah. All right, and if that's not helping you, then what you can do is go to the healing brush tool. So that was the spot healing brush, but the healing brush tool. And this tool allows you to sample from an area. You know what? As soon as I looked away, I kind of lost it. It's right here, isn't it? So now you can sample from another area and paint. So you can really make sure you're painting what you want and you're sampling from an area far enough away that your viewer is not going to notice this repetition. And then let's just sample from over here and paint a little bit on that guy. Yeah, that's pretty nice. And this little brush right here. How much stuff should you take out? Another philosophical discussion. When you squint your eyes at the image, anything that catches your eye that isn't part of your subject, isn't really important to the image, you could probably take out. But I also don't love kind of completely whitewashing, completely erasing all little artifacts from the image. So there's another balance there. But again, it depends on your final purpose for this image and your level of pickiness. So keep that in mind. So we made a couple of little changes there. And we are doing this on this upper layer. So notice that they're still there. I did it on the upper layer. And this kind of gives you, one, an easy way to back up. If you screwed up, you could just delete this layer. But two, it also lets me now do this little bit of sharpening. So now on this layer, I can go to Filter, Sharpen, and you've got a lot of different options here. I go back and forth between these different ones, but in this case, I think I'm just going to do a Smart Sharpen. And amount 200%, remove Gaussian blur, and then it's going to say OK. And now, that's too much. But look how easy it is to tell the difference. We're not looking at the difference of whether or not I removed the people, but look at the mountains and see how much more detailed and sharp they've gotten. So that's a little too much. You could reduce the opacity of this layer now. And I know I'm jumping through a lot of Photoshop. If that's something else that you'd like to see more of in the future, you can let me know in the chat or in the comments below. I can come back and talk about some of these other techniques in Photoshop a little bit more, but you can reduce this effect. But now you're like, okay, I have finished this image. It's beautiful. I love it. I'm ready to go back to Lightroom. What do I do? This is what I love. All you have to do is close it and answer yes to save. So we're going to hit that save, and it's going to take a moment to save this image, and it's going to pop you back into Lightroom. Well, it popped us. Yeah, don't worry about that. That's because I copied stuff. Boom, we're back in Lightroom, and now we have two images. And you can see the difference between the two of them. If we want to put them side by side, we can hit the C key with both of them. So it's important to note, I said this at the beginning of going into Photoshop, but I'm going to say it again. We now have two physical files. We have the original D&G that we were working on in Lightroom. And when we came back from Photoshop, we now have a PSD. So you can choose what you come back to Lightroom with. In the preferences of Lightroom, under external editing, you can come back as a TIFF or a PSD. I use PSD. I don't have a strong opinion about either. Note that right now there's a bug. TIFF files can get huge. And even if you choose compression zip, it doesn't actually compress them. And they can be easily a single image from a normal megapixel camera, like, you got a 24 or 32 megapixel camera. A TIFF from that camera can be in the gigabyte size if you've added a few layers. So one single image. So just watch out for that. PSDs can actually be a little bit less efficient with regards to metadata updates, but they work for me and I'm happy with them. So that is in the Lightroom preferences, PSD or TIFF, and I talk about that a little bit more in the handout. All right, so how are we doing? Jamie Morgan, you wanted me to enlarge that so we can see the edits. I am blind. Sorry. And why is the editing? Why is the railing still there ghosted? Because I lowered the opacity on that layer that was above. And what's kind of cool is, so this is now sitting in my documents, so I can double click it to open it back up, and I can say go back to 100%. That's going to hide that railing because again, we are just changing the opacity of this layer. So I didn't need to open it again from Lightroom in this case because it was already in my Photoshop's memory. I just had to say, use this recent document. And that's how you can adjust that. The other thing you could do now is you could erase. I'll come back to Photoshop at some point in the future. We got to start wrapping up a little bit here. So I'm going to, say save again. And it will, even though I didn't open it from Lightroom, it will adjust itself here in a moment. It should. Might prompt for there it goes. And it's gone. It updated. So Lightroom is kind of always looking and figuring things out as far as whether or not it needs to update there. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I covered this in the first workshop enough that I'm really just going to touch on it here, and that's exporting your documents, exporting your photos to save and use with the world. And I think there's a lot of confusion, especially on the print side of things. Notice up here that I've adjusted the panels or the workspaces that I see within Lightroom. I have only Library, Develop, and Map shown. Those are the only ones that I use with any regularity. Print, and the way you do this is just right click on them. Print, I don't use the print module from within Lightroom. If you're printing on your own, that's fine. But for me, I send everything I print off to Bayphoto. I love them. They make it look gorgeous, and it's so easy. Let's say, for instance, that I wanted to get a print of this edited PSD right here. I'm going to go to File, Export, and I already have a preset for print. If you're a pen member, just remind me. I can give you these presets. They also are, there are videos and documents already in pen, but you just post in the community and I'll make sure. The only thing that matters here is it is going to be a JPEG. I do export as an sRGB. There are some people with different opinions about that. Some of them fairly strong. Some people say Adobe RGB or ProPhoto RGB. It depends on your lab. You Google Bayphoto, they like them as sRGBs. So you know you're working in the same color space. There won't be any shifting. Quality is going to be 100. I leave image sizing unchecked. Whatever size I've cropped this to is going to be the full resolution that I give to Bayphoto for printing. Resolution, I said this before, I like saying this because it blows so many people's minds. It doesn't matter what you put in that box. You are giving, so let's say right now, let's cancel this for a second. This image is a 4000 by 2600 image. That's its resolution. And once you send to Bayphoto and say, hey, I want an 8 by 10 of this, they'll tell you what the DPI will be of your print. You don't need to adjust it. You just give it to them at the full resolution and the highest quality and then they will let you know what DPI for the various prints. And to get a little chart, you can figure it out. 300 DPI looks good when you're looking up close, 144 DPI if it's on the wall on the other side of your couch. So that's all down the road stuff to talk about. But really, don't super stress about it. So JPEG 100, resolution doesn't matter. And then sharpen for matte paper or glossy paper when I'm printing. If I'm printing on matte, then I choose matte. If I'm printing on metal or more metallic papers, I'll choose glossy. Usually I choose an amount low. So this is an additional sharpening that Lightroom will do on output. And the reason I usually do low is because I have, either through Lightroom or Photoshop, done my careful sharpening bits. So keep that in mind. And then all the rest of these don't matter. Watermarking, if I'm sending off to print, don't matter. And again, if you want to talk and know more about watermarking, I talk a little bit about it in the first workshop, and I also talk about it in the web design workshop, because most of the good places that you can put your work, like Zenfolio and SmugMug for sale, you can also have them automatically watermarked there on their site without having to watermark them here, which is nice because that's just an overlay, and it means that when people buy your work, you don't have to have 2 copies of every piece of your photo. You don't have to have a watermarked and a non-watermarked to make sure you're always sending to the print house, the non-watermarked. See, people have thought all of this stuff. They've come up with this and made it much easier for ourselves. So that's all I've done. So what have I done? I maybe rename it JPEG 100, sharpen for whatever medium I'm going to put it on, and then you should add this as a little export preset. I could have one that says glossy paper, matte paper, and then that would automatically save that setting there. I don't. I just change it each time. That's not too big a deal. And next time you come to print, that exporting set will be just listed here. There's for print. I have my Instagrams and my original RAWs and Squarespace galleries, like so. All right, now, not quite done, because let's see if anybody submitted images for this. I have 2 come in. So what I gave you this Zion picture. I said, edit it, send it back to me. I have Lightroom already aware of that folder. It's right here. And Robert already sent one in. Other people have sent them in during this show, though, I think. So I'm going to right-click on it, and I'm going to choose Synchronize Folder. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to force Lightroom to look into this folder that new images have been dropped into, and it might find, hey, found 9. 9 people were able to edit in the short time of this show. And some people sent some other stuff. Don't know what that is. Okay. So here they all are. I'm going to bring them in at 1-to-1. I'm not doing any developing or anything like that. And they're just getting added to the catalog. So if you have a folder that you drop images into from time to time that Lightroom is already aware of, you can just right-click on that folder inside Lightroom and choose Synchronize, and it will become aware of those articles as well. And I'll get to those questions in just a second. Let's take a look at these real quick. I think it's really neat to see the different edits. All right, so first up was Joy's. And Joy, you know what? This size, 1-to-1, you gave me back a very small image. So at that view, it's tough to see. When we zoom in, we can start to see the halos of the sharpening. So back here, I think that's quite nice, though. Fairly mild edit, not too hefty. Definitely some sharpening on the mountains there. It's pretty nice. Kenny Prentice, why are they all so small? Is everybody small? Okay. Kenny's gave me a small one too. This one is a little heavy editing for my taste. I think there's some lovely colors going on in the mountains there, but so dark down here. I think you may have used more dehaze. Orit is a very, very soft, gentle edit. Quite nice. I'd love to see a little bit more light and love from those mountains. Becky's got this one. Looks very similar to Robert's. Did you cheat with Robert? No, I'm just kidding, Becky. Very small. It's weird that some of you have. There we go. Stephanie has this one. This has, I love the light in this. A really beautiful kind of warm light that you added. That's personally what I was going for. So maybe I'm biased. that I enjoy this because it's similar to how I would have edited. I love that you've kind of emphasized some of the light on the mountains themselves. And that's what I would do as well. In my memory, little bits of that sunlight were breaking through. So these clouds right here were very thin, but the further to the west, they got thick. And so it was blocking some of that light. But every once in a while, we'd have just this kiss of warm setting sunlight on here. And you've kind of emphasized that, I think, with the local area adjustment. Nice job. Oh, we got 2 from you. Looks like you just did another one with a straighten. Nice. And John McCormick. Let's take that off for a sec. Another pretty simple edit that I think you've done a nice job. I don't think you can go wrong with being light with your edits. Larry has this beautiful picture, but I don't want to see it right now. And then that's somebody, that's not the image we want. Okay. All right. There were a couple of questions, and then we're going to wrap up. Thank you all. About 2 hours again. Stephanie, let's see. Sean, so you don't use sRGB color when exporting to Photoshop? No, not when exporting to Photoshop, because in Photoshop, so Sean, you caught that, under File, Preferences, Pro Photo RGB, that's what Photoshop recommends, and that's what I use. That brings the most colors back and forth. Why don't we export to the Photo Labs then in Pro Photo RGB? Well, because the printers can't print in that color space. And so there's no point in it. And it would also mean if you give a lab a different color profile than they use, then colors have to be matched up and they can shift a little bit. Usually it's very minor. A lot of times you're not even going to notice. But if you're picky, you might notice. And if we're talking about big prints that you're spending hundreds of dollars on, it's important to send them the profile in the color profile that lab, the color space that lab is using. So back and forth inside Lightroom and Photoshop, Pro Photo RGB, but when you go outside that, sRGB seems to have the least trouble with labs and display online as well. Stephanie wants to know, for extremely large scale prints, how do you get the best quality for the print? Maybe an idea for a future lesson. Like large size, like 3 to 5 feet on the long edge. That's awesome. I'm actually talking to Bay Photo about doing some sample prints at that size. Roy has a really nice article on pen that talks in detail about printing large, and we have a whole section on printing in pen as well that goes into deep detail about all of that so that you come out with some really nice images. The really simple answer, though, is to start with a lab that you trust. Bay Photo is fantastic. And start by sending them 4x6s, 8x10s, and normal size metal and get a feel for those images. Get them back, hold them next to your monitor, compare them to make sure the colors are what you expect so that you understand what it comes out like on their end. And then you work your way up to bigger and bigger prints. Jamie Morgan, export sizes for websites. Jamie, I know you were in the first workshop, and that handout shows all of that in detail, and I actually talk about that on page 12 of 12. So I didn't talk about it today, but I tell you what size, long edge, and what JPEG quality I recommend for online social media sharing and websites. So Kevin wants to know, how do you set sRGB in Lightroom CC, the cloud one, not the classic? I don't know, but I would bet $100 that Lightroom CC is working in sRGB all of the time. It's a very web, mobile-friendly kind of program. I think that's where it's working most of the time. All right. And then, Stephanie, you want to talk about luminosity masks in a future lesson. So that's in Photoshop. I don't use them because the masking, the range mask, holding to a luminance, that is luminosity masking. So maybe I should adjust. When you hear people like Nick Page, fantastic photographer, and he's like one of the champion of teaching about luminosity masks, all in Photoshop, that's where that happens. But for me, I get enough of what I want in the range mask luminance control that I'm happy. So probably won't be covering that personally in the future. I'd like to see a little bit more about what Nick does in that at some point in the future as well, though. So, yeah. All right. Chat room, thank you so much. I hope you found this helpful. there's no end in sight in this quarantine, so I probably will be back because I really enjoy these. If you're watching and you haven't already hit that thumbs up button, go ahead and do that, please. If you're watching and you're not currently a subscriber, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. And a reminder that this free 12-page, full-color PDF filled with tips and tricks about everything I just talked about is yours for free. You know, I actually saw somebody today giving this workshop similar to mine. At least their table of contents was identical, and it cost $399. It was an online workshop that you could sign up for, and wasn't even clear to me if you got a packet of stuff. So I really feel good about being able to give this to you all for free. That's available. If you look down below this video, you have links back to... Is it still on me? Sorry, it's still on the screen, isn't it? Sorry, I've been talking like it's not on me. Here we go. The handout. And from there, you can find the links to the old handout, that 20-page or 19-page PDF full color as well. So all that content is there. And thank you. Thank you for tuning in, and watch the Mishmash tomorrow with Steve and David Carr, and I'll be back again in the next few weeks with more content. Bye-bye, everybody.